But there's not much disagreement that IQ can be genetically inherited to some extent. It's more than 0, but it's definitely not 1.
Okay, so Pakman just mangles heritability so badly that the quickest way to respond would be to just say Pakman is wrong about what heritability means. And let me just tell you what heritability actually means. Heritability is about variance. Take a cow. What percentage of the cow is genetic? What percent of the cow is a product of its environment? It's a meaningless question. All organisms are genes expressed in an environment. It's not a certain percentage, one or the other. So when Pakman says IQ is somewhat genetically inherited or whatever, that is a literally nonsense statement. It doesn't mean anything. It can't mean anything. What we can talk about is variance. We can, in principle, look at 2 cows, take a parameter, say the weight of the cow, and come up with an estimate for how much of the variation in weight is a result of variation in genes. That is heritability. It is the variation in a given trait, so height, weight, IQ score, religiosity, that is explainable by variation in genes. What proportion of the differences in people in a trait are a result of genetic differences? That's heritability. Now, something like height and weight are straightforward to measure. Something like religiosity is more difficult to measure because you have to ask questions or maybe look at some behavior that you think are indicative of religiosity and then weigh these in some sort of an index. This is called operationalization. Like if someone wanted to measure the heritability of being funny, you would come up with some test of how funny someone was, maybe give them a situation, ask them to make jokes about it, and see how the audience responds. And the audience responses would be a measure of the funniness of the person, and you'd want to use multiple crowds or something like that. Now with IQ, it's straightforward. That's just a score on an IQ test. Done. As far as IQ is concerned. The heritability of IQ is as easy to measure as the heritability of weight. A little bit, not quite as easy because they have to sit down and do the test, but it's just as objective as the heritability of weight. And IQ fluctuates about as much as weight does on average, though obviously weight has much more potential fluctuation. You can't double your IQ as an adult, but you can double your weight. The range of fluctuation for weight is higher than IQ, even though the practical day-to-day fluctuation of IQ is, if anything, greater than practical fluctuation of weight. Whether or not you got enough sleep can affect your IQ by, 3 or 4 points, whereas it's unlikely for your weight to shift 3 or 4 pounds in the same period of time. But the point is, both are highly heritable, and they both have purely objective measures. But G is what we care about, not IQ. And like the test for religiosity, you have a test and a score on that test, and that's objective. Just like the IQ test is objective. But what you really care about is not the score on the religiosity test, but the underlying religiosity that score represents. With IQ tests, we don't care about the objective score on the IQ test, except insofar that it's a good measure of an underlying general intelligence. Okay, back to dummy Pakman. Pakman brings up the Tuddenham effect, which he erroneously calls the Flynn effect, which is that raw scores on IQ tests in the past rose as environment improved over a period of time. They're not rising now. They're going down now because environmental improvements have been exhausted as far as we know, and the fact that fertility is inversely correlated with intelligence is starting to suppress the raw IQ scores. Now, I say raw IQ scores, that's not the same as the standard score that you see. The median for whites in an IQ test will always be 100. IQ tests are normed in such a way that the white average, median, and mode, the peak of the bell curve, is set to 100 by construction. And that's fine, so long as you know what you're doing. Because if IQ tests were invented today, obviously they would never do something as racialized as this. So it's kind of a throwback to a less ideological time when people could think more freely and do stuff that was just convenient, like having, racially separated bell curves. So the median score for whites may be getting 80% of the questions right in 1990, but in 2020, the median score drops to getting 75% of the questions right. In both years, even though the median is a different raw score, that raw score is set to 100, and so it's relative. This is also why the general rise in IQ scores that occurred in the past didn't close any racial gaps, because an IQ score is actually a rank order score. And so environmental improvements helped the lower classes more than it helped the upper classes, because everyone got some environmental improvements. And the raw score gap closed between the upper and lower classes, but nobody leapfrogged anyone else between any two positions. And this is why blacks never narrowed the gap in standard score, even though they narrowed the gap in raw score, because whites benefited from environmental improvements over time as well. Even if it wasn't as much as blacks overall, the lower class whites benefited from environmental improvements just as much as lower class blacks did, for example. And so everyone is moving up. And so while there's a compression between the classes in raw score, there's no overlap, because everyone is moving up a little bit. It's just the upper classes are moving up a little bit more, but it's not enough to overtake anyone ahead of them, right? It's kind of like, it's kind of like the extension and compression of an accordion. When you compress an accordion, yeah, the little ridges get closer together, or you stretch it out, they get further apart, but there's no overlap. The rank order remains the same no matter how much you stretch or compress. And that's what's kind of happening with the Tuddenham effect, or Flynn effect. And if you don't trust me, because I'm the bad man, I'm the bad guy or whatever. Okay, well, James Flynn himself actually said basically this. And he also said that the causes of the Flynn effect, I guess we're calling it the Flynn effect now, that the causes of it, he says the causes of the Flynn effect are totally exclusive to the causes of the racial gaps. And the reason for this has to go back to what I talked about earlier, the G factor. Basically, racial gaps are total G. They're like pure G, the racial gaps. Whereas the gains from the Flynn effect are completely hollow for G. And this is what Flynn acknowledges, and he says that the Flynn effect does not explain racial gaps. So don't take it from me, because I'm the bad guy who hates brown people or whatever, to go ahead and take it from the namesake of the argument that you're using, who says that it doesn't explain racial differences. Take it from him. And based on how heritability works, it makes precisely zero sense to say things like IQ is genetically inherited anymore than it makes sense to say height is genetically inherited. This is nonsense speak done by non-biologists and non-hereditary psychologists. Or someone who isn't an autodidact and who just learned all the stuff on his own. But that's all just why Pakman's mangling of heritability in the Tuddenham or Flynn effect reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of so much of the basic terms he's speaking of.
So yeah, the people who peddle the race realist stuff about IQ are usually the same people who have this mantra about how important IQ is and how fatalistic and linked to success it is, which makes sense because IQ tests being relevant or useful to begin with is a necessary premise for everything else that follows in these hypotheses. They will say IQ tests are an authoritative measure of intelligence, and it's the most accurate measure of intelligence and of human potential. And that's how the race realists ensure that the next claim really comes with a sting, the claim that black people or Hispanic people or whoever are on average destined to have lower IQs. So basically those groups are predetermined to live measurably lower quality lives.
Now, this is such a crazy and hyper-ideological way of describing the situation. Whites in the US are the only people who can be legally discriminated against, and who are discriminated against in college admissions and in getting a job. We know this because white people at the same jobs at the same companies have higher objective and subjective performance ratings. In fact, whites do better on the objective performance ratings than the subjective one, nullifying any notions that they're being favored in the performance ratings. What this means is that employers are hiring less capable blacks at any given position than whites. And this is going to be true with Hispanics as well, given that all this stems from a racism against the European diaspora. At the UC system in California, for example, they have something called the Holistic Index, where they take circumstantial factors into letting someone in on top of their resume otherwise. And this is supposed to be divorced from race. However, a Freedom of Information Act revealed that this wasn't enough, because the UC system, through this index, they ended up accepting just a bunch of whites and Asians who theoretically had poor circumstances according to the holistic index. They were accepting basically no blacks got in, even with the holistic index scores. The UC system thus had to engage in pure racial discrimination over and above any circumstantial disadvantage. Keep in mind, this did not happen in the Jim Crow South. Blacks who attended universities in the Jim Crow South had lower performances than the whites who did, both in terms of their entrance credentials and in terms of their performance while at the universities, which means less capable blacks were being accepted to Southern universities than the whites were, even in the Jim Crow South. Affirmative action favoring blacks in the Jim Crow South. And that's just one thing. That's just one little red sliver of a pill. And Pakman here, he's talking about wanting worse lives or whatever, and I don't know who the fuck he's talking about. He doesn't cite anyone, just this vague, they want brown people to suffer. This is a cartoon. Aren't you guys supposed to be nuanced thinkers? Aren't you guys supposed to be sophisticated and able to understand complex arguments? And then you say this garbage that's straight out of a movie villain. Speaking for myself, I want social justice. I want the privileged races to have their privilege taken away, and I want their racist revenge narratives, their racial nationalism to be refuted, and for the people who push these narratives to be destroyed. I want it to be recognized as a form of bigotry, as a form of racism, and as a form of privilege that needs to be deconstructed and removed. In the backwards world we're in today, what Pakman says, and this thing that I'm up against, it's called the left. But Pakman is really an agent of what should be called the far right. They are humorless, socially authoritarian busybodies who want to prohibit you from saying anything bad or even joke about the privileged groups. They then scapegoat the European diaspora as being responsible for all the world's problems, when it is undeniable that the European diaspora ended feudalism worldwide, ended slavery worldwide, created the modern economy as we know it. And Pakman then makes a really angry face when his hate fuel is questioned. He pushes the talking points of the establishment, from Amazon to Google to Burger King to McDonald's, Facebook. Pick a company and it's either apolitical or pushes the hate narratives that Pakman pushes. And of course, institutional media is all on his side, and the government itself racially discriminates against Europeans and has quotas set for the privileged groups. Pakman, you are a racist, a nationalist, and a theocrat by proxy in your support for Islam. You support the capitalists, you support the party bosses, even the Pope agrees with you. All of the retrograde forces in the world, all of the bad guys are on your side. Think about it, Pakman. When all of the traditionally bad guys and bad organizations in history are on your side, maybe you want to think for 2 seconds. Maybe you want to reconsider what you're saying for just 2 seconds when all of the bad actors are on your side. And of course, they have convinced you that what they are is precisely the opposite of what they are. Hitler hated IQ tests because they didn't conform to his ideology, and so did Stalin. The Nazis created a bogus IQ test based on a series of literature questions, nothing but information, and a subjective assessment of intelligence by the proctor. The proctor would interview you, and then he would subjectively rate how smart he thought you were. The real IQ tests Hitler hated, and he called them Jewish because Jews did so well on them, right? A group that he scapegoated for all the world's problems, right? Sound familiar, Pakman? And Stalin hated IQ tests because he called them bourgeois, right? Because the bourgeois did well on them. And who did the Soviet Union scapegoat for all the world's problems? The bourgeois. Sound familiar? What do you call them, Pakman? We know what Hitler called them. We know what Stalin called them. What do you call them? What is your reason for dismissing them? What are your ideological reasons for dismissing them? And how do you feel about the results? Results which stand against your rape and revenge narratives and which stand against your hatred of the European diaspora.
And that's just that. It might be sad, we might not like it, but it's the truth.